Today's episode of Socially Democratic is presented to you by Dunn Street. Dunn Street is a campaign agency that specialises in community organising. We only work with people that want to build power to make the world a better place, including community-based organisations, trade unions, progressive businesses and social democratic parties across the globe. We develop community engagement strategies to win campaigns both big and small, and we train engagement staff and volunteers in the Gantt framework of leadership, organising and action. And we help folks craft their story through the practice of public narrative that connects people through shared values and then moves them to act together. And if you want to create change in your community in 2024, then hit us up at dunnstreet.com.au. Today's episode is also brought to you by Maurice Blackburn Lawyers. As Australia's #1 plaintiff law firm, Maurice Blackburn believe the law should serve everyone and not just those who can afford it. And they've helped influence some of Australia's most important legal decisions, including equal pay for women and Indigenous workers, and helped over 500,000 Australians get the compensation they deserve. Maurice Blackburn Lawyers, experience that you can count on. Hello and welcome to another episode of Socially Democratic, your weekly centre-left politics and organising podcast that dives into the progressive issues of the day and the people leading them from home and abroad. That drops every Friday, but we're dropping this one early because there is an election on in Tasmania this coming Saturday. So we've decided to do a election preview with a good friend of mine, political consultant Jack Milroy from Tassie. We've had him on the show before, and today we're just going to run through what's happened since we last spoke in terms of the campaign and get our focus and energy centred on Saturday. And don't forget, if you haven't got involved in the campaign for Labor, there are links in the bio in which you can either donate your time to knock on doors and make calls if you live in Tasmania. And if you don't live in Tasmania, but you'll want to help, then you can donate your money. And so there's a link there to their fundraising page. So every dollar, even in this late stage of the campaign, can go a long way to help Labor elect a Labor government in the Ample Isle. And then we'll have wall-to-wall Labor governments across the country. Wouldn't that be fantastic on Saturday night? So please do so. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts from. And if you like the show, please give us 5 stars and leave us a review where those podcast apps let you do that. And for all of our updates on the show, please follow Dunn Street on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Okay, let's get to today's early edition episode. We are taping this one on a Monday lunchtime on the lands of the Wurundjeri people. Ambitious to schedule a podcast the day after St. Patrick's Day, but here we are. I'm here. I can tell you folks that I am not piss fit because I've given up alcohol for Lent, and yesterday was my only day off of breaking the fast. Anyway, here we are today doing a podcast, and I'm alive and awake because we're getting ready for the Tasmanian election, which is this Saturday, and we're going to do a preview of the poll and then do a review of the poll next week. And to help me do that, I'm once again joined by Tasmania's finest political consultant and campaigner. I've worked on a number of campaigns, not just in Tasmania, but also on the mainland as well. Jack Milroy, welcome back to Socially Democratic.
Great to be here, Stephen. And I was just thinking, there's never been any rowdy Irish Catholics in Tasmania in the history of the state. So I'm sure that there weren't any rowdy St. Patrick's Day celebrations here yesterday either. I wouldn't know about that.
Absolutely, yeah, I know. I remember the Batman by-election. Was it still called Batman, or was it called Cooper by the stage when we won? Anyway, after David Feeney, friend of the pod, pulled out of politics, and we had that by-election. The by-election was on St. Patrick's Day, and wow. I was working for a party office then, so it is my job to campaign, and I felt weird about it, just working on what is a holiday of obligation for me, and also wanting to wear green, but we were up
Yes.
against the Greens. So it
I was
was.
just thinking maybe you can explain the surge in the vote there just with the green corflutes on the day. They
Well,
could have probably played into it more than they did. I'm not sure how much they did, but they should have gone in on that.
I know. Well, I end up I worked on all day, and then when polls closed, I can't remember what I did. I think I might have actually ran home and then went and had drinks with sort of family and friends at a pub in the city, and then came back and joined the after party. But I had like a green T-shirt on or something, and this sea of red, and I got some funny looks from some folks. Anyway, but we won, so who cares? All right, let's do this. We are in the red zone for the election, which is this Saturday. A lot to cover. I want to start with polling. There's been when you were on the show last time, there really wasn't a lot of published polls, but obviously we've had a number of them now. Tell us about what we're seeing from the research that's been done on voter sentiment.
Yeah, we've had 3 published public polls since the start of the campaign and since we spoke last. So we had one covering kind of the early part of the campaign, mid-February, then kind of one covering late February, and then we've just had one that covers kind of early March. Essentially, those 3 polls from reputable good pollsters, EMRS, Redbridge, and UComs, they basically put the Liberal vote, Liberals currently hold government, the Liberal vote anywhere between at the high end, 39%, or at the low end, 33%. And they put Labor anywhere between 29 at the high end and 23 at the low end. And so what the general story that the polls are kind of telling is that if you believe the public polls, the Liberals have lost a big chunk of their vote since the last election, remembering they received 49% primary vote in 2021. So if they are down somewhere in the mid to high 30s, that's a big chunk lost. And that's really, at this stage, hasn't flowed to Labor. If you're just looking at the public polls, that's kind of flowed to the Jackie Lambie network and to kind of the independent or other column. How that will shake out on election days, particularly with those independent others, will be hard to tell. A lot of those independents are kind of concentrated in particular seats. But at this point, there's a couple of ways to look at it. Either there's a big chunk of vote undecided floating around that's parked with independent and other, or people are planning to vote independent. We're going to see an independent vote like we've never seen before. Hard to say from the public polls.
Going with option B to begin with, if it transpires that this is actually a transfer of vote from Liberal primary to a group of independents and the Greens, what would then the makeup of the parliament look like?
It's going to make the parliament pretty unwieldy, I would say. It's going to mean that whichever party would have the most seats, and looking at public polling right now, that would be the Liberal Party. They probably won't have a majority of seats. So they won't get to 18, remembering we're going from a 25-seat parliament expanding to 35 seats, so they need 18 for a clear majority. So in the case where there's a large independent vote, we're probably going to see the Liberals somewhere, in the kind of 14s or something like that seats, and need to pull some folks together to get that majority of confidence and supply. So they'll probably be looking to pull Jackie Lambie members, if there are any, and then some potential independents as well. Of course, there's always the wild card of the Greens. The Greens have said they prefer to form government with Labor, but have not ruled out forming government with the Liberals. So look, there's multiple kind of paths to a majority. But how stable that will be, which is kind of the pitch that the Liberals are making, how stable that will actually be is kind of, a little bit dicey.
That's interesting. And then option A, in which that you're hypothesizing that this sort of 10%, 10, maybe even 15% collapse in the Liberal primary is being currently parked with independents and the Greens and Jackie Lambie and whatnot. I'm just wondering about, first of all, when did pre-poll begin?
Pre-poll began at least a week ago. People have been voting now for, I would say, probably a week to 2 or a week to 10 days, something like that.
Yeah.
There will be, I think we had a roughly 30% pre-poll in 21. I'm just going off the top of my head here. Mm-hmm. What I do know is that traditionally Tasmania has not been a vote early state. That's not true. You have needed a particular reason, I think, under law. But over the years, and particularly accelerated by COVID, that pre-poll number has gone way up, and the Electoral Commission kind of will take any reason, as I understand it, I'm sure a lawful reason, but
Yep.
apparently 30% of the state can have one. So I would expect that by election day, we would have over 30% of folks already voted.
So I guess, I mean, these numbers aren't great, let's be honest here, for Labor. And I'm just looking for ways in which we can find some silver linings amongst these statistics. Talking to former colleagues that still work for the party, in a number of recent polls, both the federal election in seat level polling and also the most recent by-elections that we've had, Aston and Dunkley being the case, that the Labor Party's own private polling was a little under what the final result was. And I'm just wondering, I mean, you've given us a bit of a range here between 23 and 29% primary. I'm wondering, even if you take the higher mark, which is 29, and think, is that being undersurveyed? And maybe we're sitting at 31, 32. What does that then do? Because if you put the Libs on the lowest, which is 31, the two major parties are sitting around low 30s.
Yeah.
What can that get Labor?
Yeah, and I think that that's plausible to start with. So I think, a few things. If you look at the poll that had us at 23%, it's a UComm's poll, so it's a reputable pollster. I'm not going to go unskewing the polls. But at the same time, UComm's, as I understand it, was off significantly in Tasmania last time. So we just kind of want to put that one out there. Yep. EMRS, which is a local pollster and always pretty bang on, does have us higher. And Redbridge, which also is a good pollster, has us back up at 29. So I kind of want to, I don't want to, be a poll truther, but I do think 23% is probably a little bit low. I wouldn't really put too much stock in that. So if then we're at the case where, okay, there's a chunk of undecided that kind of gravitate towards us in the last week, and the campaign's having, the campaign has some momentum, and the message has been pretty disciplined. So if a chunk of those fall over to us and we do end up somewhere in the low 30s, potentially exceeding our vote from 21, well, that's going to mean a few things. So it's not going to mean a majority government, but it could mean that our seat count is up there approaching where the Liberals are. And in that case, if there is a big crossbench, there are all sorts of things that can happen at that point. So I wouldn't put a minority Labor government completely out of reach. No, not at all. I think that that's still in the bounds of possibility. But I would also say, taking a kind of longer term look at the party and kind of rebuilding the party down here, as the House has expanded, there's an opportunity to pick up additional seats on top of our incumbents that can help grow our bench and grow our kind of caucus for the future. And if our vote were to tick up into those low 30s, we stand a good chance of picking up some of those folks and bringing them into the lower house, which will then help them next time because of the incumbency advantage. So we've got really interesting candidates like John Kamara running in Clark. We've got Josh Willey coming down from the upper house to run in Clark as well, and we have folks in the other seats doing that too. So I'd say there's kind of two things going on. The more we can win, the closer we get to potentially cobbling together a minority, which would be fantastic. But if that doesn't happen, and not to say that the goal isn't to win elections, because it is, that's how we measure success. But if we are able to pick up some new kind of talent and some new blood for our caucus going forward, that's also something that's really positive, and also something I'd say we really need to do, given the House is expanding. And if we get a whole bunch of Lambie folks and independents in there, it can be hard to get them out, as we've seen kind of at the federal level.
I'm you probably don't have this information at hand, but I'm asking, I guess, your Tasmanian intuition here. Where do you see, if a number of these votes are now currently being parked on other, being Greens, Lambie and Independents, where is that happening electorally?
Yeah, and that's a good question, because it's not evenly distributed across the 5 electorates, right? And that is one of the challenges of all this polling, right? Is that it is statewide polling, but the parties don't receive an equal share of the vote across the 5 electorates. So, for example, there'll be a big chunk of that independent other will probably be you could attribute to David O'Byrne in Franklin, former leader of the Labor Party and State Secretary of United Voice United Workers Union in Tasmania, formerly of the party, now no longer in the party. So you would assume that he's pulling a chunk of that independent vote in Franklin. We've got other folks, Lara Alexander, who was one of the Liberals who split from the Liberal Party to become an independent, which kind of kicked off this whole thing. She's running in Bass. There's potential that there's some a vote going there. In the northwest, so in Braddon, there's kind of a perennial candidate, Craig Garland, who kind of runs for everything, as I understand it, and he's kind of on the left, kind of environmental side of things. I guess it's a bit hard to kind of, I think, pigeonhole his politics, but has good support in the community. There could be some independent vote being kind of parked there. Those are the kind of the main ones I would say. Oh, and there's also John Tucker, who was the second Liberal who split from the party to kind of precipitate this election. He's running in Lyons, so there could be some of that vote is also being, you could attribute to Tucker in Lyons.
Just looking at the trends from that YouGov poll back in 4th of January, or over that sort of New Year period, 4th of January 2024. Weird time to poll. Anyway, who the hell's answering their phones over the Christmas, New Year's? I don't know. But the Lambie poll was polling at 20%. And
well, I think that's who was answering their phones.
Yeah, right. And the Greens are basically across these four polls you've sent me. I've held up sort of 15, 12, 14, 14. So the average, sort of 14, 13. But Lambie's gone from 20 to 9, 10, 8. So that 8%, 9% seems more accurate than that poll back in January. Whereas the independents have ballooned from sort of averaging around 7% to then climbing 15 to 18%. Is that the kind of, those characters that you were speaking about before, is that where we're seeing a rise? People are starting to pay attention to those types of candidates as the election becomes, in the front of people's minds?
I think it's a bit of that. And I also think that once the Lambie Network was exposed to the campaign, they've been subject to a particularly savage campaign by the Liberals. Clearly, the Liberals sensed some danger there among their own vote. The Lambie Network has made some strange strategic choices in this election, kind of showing their kind of, greenness to the process. Like, they haven't adopted any policies at all, or kind of really any kind of position. So they're kind of playing for a kind of a kingmaker, queenmaker position in the parliament without really saying, what their preferences are on a range of issues. And the Liberals in particular have highlighted that through paid advertising and media in the last couple of weeks in particular. So I think in the kind of glare of the campaign, the Lambie candidates haven't held up as well. And we've seen this in these types of parties led by a kind of a larger-than-life figure who is a good politician, so Jackie Lambie in this case, but Jackie's not on the ballot. So I think that might be what has happened to the Lambie vote, and it's kind of parking itself at a more reasonable 8 to 10% level that I think better reflects what they'll likely end up with.
Is Jackie Lambie on the campaign trail?
Somewhat, I think, yes. I think she's campaigning. It hasn't been a particularly, I don't know, like the Lambie campaign has been a little bit AWOL, I think you could say at times. They haven't been particularly out there. They're not running in Clark either, and to be fair, like, I live in Clark, so I wouldn't see a lot of their stuff. So I think that they've nominated, I think, three candidates in every other electorate, and they seem to be decent enough candidates in terms of having community, involvement and stuff like that. Not speaking to their politics necessarily, but Lambie has not been kind of out there leading the news every day. No, Lambie's not the leader, as far as I can tell, of the party. She hasn't been participating in debates and things like that. So she has been featured pretty heavily by the Liberals in their negative advertising, though. So they're definitely not trying to run away from her as the kind of chair. I would say she's kind of like the chair of the Lambie Network. That's the best way to kind of describe it.
Not wanting to turn this into a Jackie Lambie podcast, but as a political consultant, don't you find that fascinating? You spoke to the greenness of their campaign. If you were running that campaign, you'd be saying to Jackie, you either go all in or don't go in at all. Like, you can't just be in this halfway house. You are the strongest asset to this campaign. Yes. I need you out there every single friggin' day with all these candidates.
100%. And from my understanding in South Australia, that's what Nick Xenophon did when he ran the Xenophon team or whatever like that. And of course, that all collapsed in the end. But absolutely, like I would have Jackie out there every single day on the doors and doing media ops and all sorts of things. And she's commenting on the campaign and certainly not absent from the campaign, but isn't kind of they aren't presenting her as kind of an equal to Rebecca White or Rosalie Woodruff or any of the other kind of opposition party leaders.
Let's go back to the centre and leave the fringe and talk about the actual campaign. I want to get a sense from you of what you've seen in terms of the two narratives from both Labor and the Tories, starting with the good guys. What's been the pitch, both about ourselves or our campaign and our opponents?
Labor kicked off the campaign on the day that the election was called with a pretty good launch/stunt on power prices. So this was designed to kind of frame the campaign around the cost of living. So that was kind of the initial strategic frame that Labor took to the campaign, a pledge to cap power prices as one of the biggest contributors to kind of household cost of living pressures. And they've maintained that frame, but they have also kind of added an additional one and kind of gone between the two, I would say, which is the Liberals have had 10 years, don't give them 4 more. So they must be picking up some tiredness in the community, which makes sense, tracks with kind of, anecdotally what you hear.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're running on a kind of, I'd say kind of like a hybrid cost of living, and the Liberals have had too much time. Let's not give them a whole nother 4 years. Additionally, I'd say in the last week, they've introduced this kind of, extremist critique. So using Eric Abetz, who is quite extreme, and running paid ads on his record and some of the things he's said and done over the years and the positions he's taken to kind of wedge the Liberal Party. So far, the Liberals haven't really responded to that, which is probably the smart thing on their part. So I'd say there's some new kind of messages coming out in the last week, but generally it's been cost of living and let's not give the Liberals 14 years in power.
Right. I'll come back and critique these in a moment or get your reflections on them. But just to set up the context of this, what are the Tories saying about themselves and saying about us?
Oh, well, their pitch is, vote Liberal, get strong, stable government, or else you're going to end up with a Labor coalition of chaos, as they call it. That's been their pitch all the way through. They've pretty much stuck to that overall frame, even if a whole bunch of their kind of policies and announcements haven't necessarily supported that frame, which is I would say, a failure of the campaign. But, strong, stable Liberal government versus coalition of chaos on the Labor side. That's basically been their frame.
Okay, so that's interesting. That was my next question. Is that then playing out in the policy drops that both parties are announcing? Let's go with the Libs right now. You're saying that it's not reflected in what we're seeing in terms of their policies are not reflecting their narrative.
Well, I'd say what both parties have done in this campaign as much as possible is to neutralize each other's policy announcements. So overwhelmingly, when one party has announced kind of a marquee policy or a policy that might kind of be popular or have some populist overtones, the other party just matches it immediately. They just say, yep, we're in, we support that. So the effect of that has been to kind of neutralize debate over big topics and kind of render the election almost a discussion over kind of process and mechanics of Parliament, I think. And I don't think voters particularly enjoy that for like obvious reasons. It doesn't.
No, they love process. They just think it's fantastic. They really want to get their head in the weeds of government.
Yeah,
That's what they. Every day between looking after the kids and getting them to school, they want the process stories.
Yes. Look, the Labor campaign has tried to pull the election out of that with a whole bunch of detailed policy announcements. But and they're great policies, and if they're implemented, would have massive changes for the positive in Tasmania. I do think, though, that it's hard to get people to care about policy ever, even though politicians really care about policy. They're good to demonstrate your values, and I think that's important. They're important for coalitions and stakeholders. But I think that what has happened is that the Liberals have been able to frame this up as about we're the only chance you get to not have the chaos that we caused in the last 4 years, which is, the gall of that is pretty striking.
Yeah.
We have to kind of acknowledge that. It's like these guys are the ones who couldn't go full term for the last 2 terms. And now they're throwing it back and saying, if you go with the other guys, they won't be able to,
do what we couldn't do twice.
Yeah. But in some ways, I think it has redounded to their benefit, because it's kind of like, how the Trump thing, the projection thing, where he says the thing about someone else that actually is his weakness, like, oh, this person will be corrupted by foreign influence, or this person, is creepy or whatever.
Yeah.
And in some ways, I think what the Liberals have done is they jumped in and owned that space really, really early on. And I think it's been difficult for Labor and the Greens. We haven't talked about the Greens, but the Greens have had a pretty quiet campaign, I would say. They haven't been able to get the coverage that they might have expected. So have their policies been supporting that overall frame? Insofar as they're announcing a lot of policies and they'll say they'll implement them, I think there's a real skepticism in the Tasmanian public about the ability of the government, the state, in a sense, to deliver any serious reforms. And I think that goes across both and all parties. I think that there's been successive failures in governance in this state over decades that have meant a lot of election promises and not a lot of actual implementation of those promises. So I think that actually makes it quite difficult for a good progressive policy-focused campaign like the one Labor has run to get traction, because I think that there's just a deep level of skepticism here. I mean, there is everywhere, right? But I have a feeling that it's a little stronger here, and that trust in institutions, for a good reason, is weaker in Tasmania.
That's really interesting insight. So then if you're Labor, you're running the campaign, then how do you overcome that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, if you were starting from scratch, you want to show competence. You want to show that you're trustworthy, stable, steady. And I think since we had the intervention, some of those things have happened. I think you also have to inspire some hope, because I don't get a sense that there's a lot of hope. There's a lot of, we've had these promises before. The Liberals promised this, they promised that. And unfortunately, what seems to happen is that the Liberals aren't blamed for over-promising, under-delivering. It kind of is like, pox on all their houses. So I think it's a challenging thing to overcome, and probably takes some time. I think the best way to overcome it is to get ourselves into government somehow. Obviously, clearly, I'm not, that's not a great strategic insight, but and then deliver some reforms from beginning to end, and show that competence. And then I think, we set ourselves up for multiple terms in government.
A lot of that hope that you talk about, but also competency, really leans heavily on the leaders of the two parties. So let's just focus on the good guys first. Rebecca White, this is her third crack at, which I'd said to someone over the weekend, or maybe it was yesterday at the pub. They were like, really, 3 times? I was surprised by that. And as I said it out aloud, I was like, yeah, that surprises me as well. But that's right. How has she been on the campaign? And in moments of, the campaign cycle, debates and policy launches and campaign kickoffs and all that kind of stuff. How have you seen her leadership play out in this race?
Yeah, actually, on the 3-term thing, I was thinking the other day about if that is a record in Australia, and apparently Lawrence Springborg in Queensland ran 3 times as opposition leader. I guess this is in the Beattie era, and maybe the Bligh era too. I'm not sure exactly what overlap there was there. So there's precedent for it, but not much. I think Beck has performed well this campaign. I think the campaign overall has been a disciplined campaign, certainly compared to 2021. I think that Beck always performs well in the media, and the message is always steady and strong. But, I mean, by the time you get to the 3rd election campaign, novelty is a thing, and it does potentially wear off. And I wonder how much the Labor campaign is cutting through under the leader's voice at this point. But I couldn't fault the performance. I think that Beck's done everything that she needed to do in this campaign. For Rockliff, for the Premier, yeah, he's similar. He's also a good performer. He's steady. He delivers his lines. There's nothing particularly inspiring about him. I don't think people have completely switched off him yet, even though he's been around a really long time. This is his first time running as the leader of the party. There was a debate last week, I believe, but in the way that these state election debates have gone, do you remember the days where the leaders would be on like State Line or kind of a statewide televised thing, and it would be a big deal when the Premier and the opposition leader would debate, and that potentially might still happen in the mainland states. But I think this was like a business lunch type thing. If it was televised, it was probably on Sky, so I don't know, maybe 1,000 people watched it or something.
Yeah.
from what I've heard of that debate, both leaders held their own. There was an interruption of protest from the Bob Brown Foundation talking about native logging, and that basically took all the coverage. So the debate was, I would say, kind of a non-factor in the campaign.
Yeah, and when you're coming from opposition and coming from behind as well in the polling, you need to create moments to, supercharge your campaign and get good exposure to get your messages out. And so when you're having I'm sure that the Tories have intentionally tried to play down this whole debate. Not that I ever think debates really can swing an election, but they are moments of risk for government and moments of opportunity for oppositions. And it's frustrating then that they only had some sort of friggin' men's businessman's lunch kind of thing.
That's kind of what it felt like. The Labor campaign has been smart in how they've deployed kind of their other surrogates, so like their senior shadow ministers. This has felt more like a team campaign, and I mean that in a good way. Like they've highlighted folks who will be senior ministers in a Labor government. They've used people strategically. So for some of the more stunty type things, they've used Dean Winter, who's a member for Franklin and I think Shadow Finance, and some of the upper house folks who are not up for election in this election. So they've been a bit more strategic about how they deploy Beck, which I think has been good. Always using your leader as the person to have to deliver the attacks can kind of sometimes rebound, and they haven't done that this time. So I think that's been smart. But look, the polls are where they are, so it's hard to tell at this point kind of how things are going to shake out. But if it is a third election loss, there's probably some deeper stuff there than just the people who are sitting in the chairs.
Yeah. Let's talk about the campaign content, both online materials you've seen, TV ads, that kind of stuff. What's your impression of what the Labor campaign looks like in that respect?
Yeah, the Labor campaign's focusing pretty heavily in two areas. So obviously it's hair clerks. So there's a lot of candidate-specific advertising, particularly on digital, that either the campaigns run themselves, the candidates run themselves, or the central campaign runs centrally through their accounts. So you'll see a lot of just kind of bio-type stuff, like I'm Toby Thorpe, I'm running in Franklin, here's who I am kind of stuff. There's a lot of that. There's a lot of spending behind that. There's also, kind of the main thrust of the ads that Labor is running. There's some kind of positive stuff that kind of highlights 4 or 5 policy areas, I guess, that Labor will pursue, including some visuals of the leader. And then there are also the kind of what I would say is the neg ads, which are really about the Liberals have had 10 years. Don't give them 4 more, don't give them 14. Those ads are interesting just visually because they're presented in the Liberals' colour palette. So when you first look at it, it looks like a Liberal ad on your phone. But if you read it, then it clearly is an attack ad on the Liberals. I'm interested to see how that works out, whether the right people are stopping their scroll at that point. I'd be interested if there's any data behind that. You can test these things. I don't know. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that sort of stuff?
I was going to be a smartass and say, stop the press. Wait a minute. We're doing a negative that isn't in grayscale, black and yellow for the first time in, 20 years?
I'm sure we're doing that too. I'm just not being served that.
Well, have you not noticed that the Libs are doing that? The Libs have been doing that the last 2 or 3 sort of major elections, certainly here in Victoria, maybe even in New South Wales. I saw it. They used Labor Party colouring for their negs.
Yeah.
And I thought at the time, because it does catch you out. You initially think it's a Labor Party billboard or an ad or frigging digital or whatever, right? And then you go, oh, wait, that's a negative. I don't know.
There's probably something in trying to associate the brand with negative emotion, right? There's probably if the ad's designed to inspire a negative feeling in someone, and then that the brand of your opponent is the thing that is associated with that, it's probably that. Either that or it's just funny to do a negative ad with your opponents. It's trolly. I don't know. Maybe there's science behind it. Maybe it's just fun.
Well, it's just interesting also then the Libs have finally moved off of remember they used to always get the Labor Party logo and then dirty it up with like cobwebs and bird shit on it. And it would always be that sort of Labor's tired and old. So actually physically dirtying up the brand logo by saying the brand of Labor is tired and old. And they would do that year after year, but I actually think they stopped doing it because we kept on changing our logo so often that they couldn't keep up with their graphic department to actually shit on the current logo. But they've stopped doing that now, and obviously they've just started using our colours. Maybe they're a bit obsessed with us. I don't know. Anyway, interesting. I don't think it really matters either way. Really, I think that the actual central narrative, not the device of the negative, is a thing that actually probably has more of an impact. But we'll see. I know lots of our supporters out there hate negative advertising, but can I tell you, folks, it works, and that's why we spend so much money on it. Any other thoughts on ad spend or creative that you're seeing that's interesting in this campaign?
Yeah, I've been tracking the digital ad spending just as a little bit of a fun hobby throughout this campaign and tweeting it out. So I can probably talk a little bit about that if that's interesting.
Yeah, do it. Let's do it.
Yeah, so basically, I'll talk about two sections. So we've got ad spend on Meta, which is Facebook and Instagram and associated products, and then we've got ad spend on Google, which includes Google search, Google placement, and YouTube. So on the Facebook, Meta, Instagram side of things, over the last 30 days, this is how the spending breaks down. So Labor have spent 31.8 thousand on Meta in the last 30 days. Liberals at 27.7, Greens at 16. David O'Byrne was an independent candidate at 8,500, and the Lambie network has spent less than 5K. So what are the takeaways from that? The takeaways from that are that Labor is outspending everyone on Meta ads. The Liberals are kind of close behind that. The Greens are spending about half of what Labor is spending, and one independent candidate is spending a lot of money on Facebook ads.
And the second group of advertising we're seeing?
Yeah, so the second group of ads we're seeing is on Google. So what we're seeing there is Labor outspending the Liberals again. Labor looks like we spent around close to 40K on Google stuff. And then we've got the Liberals spending around 30, 35K. Some of this is a bit tricky because it's divided up between different advertisers and you kind of have to cobble them together. So the National Secretariat might be spending some money in Tasmania on the party's behalf for either party, and then individual candidates will be spending money. But essentially you've got Labor ahead again a little bit on Google, Liberals a little bit behind, and then the Greens spending quite a bit more on Google relative to Facebook, I would say. And then nothing much else to kind of report. The Lambie network spending a small amount. So the overall takeaways from this are that I think the digital ad spending overall is lower than probably what it was at this point in 2021. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. Something that when I was working on the digital team in 21, and what we noticed is that at a certain point in your, particularly Facebook ad spend, in Tasmania, in a small market, you actually run out of people to serve ads to. Like, you've actually shown your ad to everyone. Like, forget micro-targeting. You can just show everyone your ad in Tasmania. There's just, the population is not that big, and there's not that many other advertisers on the platform, that you can actually just show your ad to someone 5, 6, 7, 8 times a day. And by the time you're doing that, you may actually be doing damage to your vote if people are being that annoyed by political ads. So if the campaigns have scaled back their ad spending this time, I don't think that's necessarily a sign of anything other than that they're looking at what is an effective use of their spend. That said, I would expect in the last week that they'll throw everything at it, whether it's necessarily strategic or not. All parties will just get their money out the door, and social media ads is somewhere you can put money out the door quickly compared to billboards or whatever where there's a large lead time.
Are you seeing much variation in what is being advertised this time around compared to previous elections?
It looks like this time around the Labor campaign is prioritising more of a spend on individual candidate content, which I think is good and smart. And whereas last time we spent a lot on kind of central messaging, central policy stuff, I'm seeing less of that this time, which I think, again, is also smart. And the Liberals, kind of counter to that, are spending a lot more on their overall kind of message, framing up the election as stability versus chaos. So it's an interesting, it's a very interesting strategic situation where the parties are not necessarily, the messages are not necessarily speaking to each other. They're trying to each define what the kind of ballot box question is going to be. Are people going to walk into the ballot box and be thinking about stability and chaos, or are people going to walk into the ballot box and be thinking about, geez, the Liberals have had a long time and it'd be good if we had, some, more funding for schools, So I think, I don't know which of those is going to win out, but I think it's an interesting thing going on whether or not the election isn't, it's a fight over the question and not necessarily a fight over the answer to the question at this point, which is fun to watch play out.
What are you seeing on the ground? We talked on the last episode about some of the ways in which the Labor Party campaign in a Hare-Clark environment to get more coordination between candidates so that they're not eating each other's lunch in terms of, and by that I mean for mainland listeners, knocking on the same doors as your fellow Labor candidate and fighting for the same votes, but being a lot more centrally coordinated, or a lot more coordinated at a grassroots level. How's that playing out, do you think, this time around?
Yeah, that's right. So if you recall, there's been some ACT branch influence in Tasmania in the last couple of years, which is a good thing because ACT know how to do Hare-Clark really well in a really professionalised way. So one of the outcomes of that was, and this is a bit cloudy, obviously, unless you're on the inside, exactly how these lists are working, but essentially giving candidates lists to door knock that don't overlap with another candidate in that same electorate, so there isn't confusion. So my understanding is that that's broadly going pretty well, and that there haven't certainly been, at least that's broken out publicly, any kind of disputes around that sort of stuff. And there seems to be a whole bunch of candidates that are supporting each other and kind of appearing at each other's events, which I think is, as a Labor Party member, that's a nice thing to see. You like it when you see an incumbent MP, lifting up someone who's a candidate on the ticket. I think that's great. Strategically, I'm not sure. If you were to think about this from a pure kind of strategic point of view, I don't know. I don't know if it's the most strategic thing, but it's certainly a nice thing to see as part of the Labor family. The Liberals, by contrast, I think have always had a bit of a more, eat what you kill, winner takes all kind of mentality around this stuff, which makes sense. They're not a party that's based in collectivism like our party, so I think they're just going wherever and whenever they want. And it's probably meaning that some of their kind of more well-funded candidates in each electorate are probably taking a bigger share of attention. Now, whether that is potentially actually a better thing for maximising their return of elected MPs, I don't know. But I would say there's a contrast between the two campaigns on this.
Yeah, it is interesting, isn't it? I mean, I've never really, obviously, not operating in a Hare-Clark environment, I've never really started to sort of analyse how you could campaign in different ways in Hare-Clark. It's almost like a basketball team in some respects. Like, in the NBA, you've got your one or two top players and then you build a team around that. Or do you build a team in which everyone is equal? Do you share your shots, or is it, no, give this person the ball in the last 5 minutes of the game to just, win this game for us? Like in Hare-Clark, do you do that? Do you say, no, we're all equal? Or do you go, no, this is the top of the ticket. This is the people we're going to prioritise, and we're all just going to try and help the team win together?
Yeah, we're doing a bit of both, I would say, the Labor campaign, because, while I do say there's, lots of outward cooperation between candidates, and there is, and that's really nice, some of these candidates, let's not kid ourselves. Some of these candidates are way better funded than other Labor candidates on the ticket. And that is not necessarily seen day to day, but it is seen in, the amount of ads that candidates are able to purchase, or whether they have paid staff, or, all of that sort of stuff. So there is still clearly a, for want of a better word, kind of a pecking order, or a kind of, tiers within the each electorate on the ticket. But certainly there's an outward air of support, which is lovely. The Greens do this differently. The Greens nominate a lead candidate in each electorate. I think they still run a full slate because it's important for harvesting preferences. But they run a lead. They identify a lead candidate. So obviously in the seats where they have incumbents, that's the incumbent. And in other seats, they nominate someone and they say, "You're our lead candidate. Greens vote one this person." They have a how to vote order for their voters. So I think that makes a lot of sense when you don't have a elected in each electorate yet. When you're trying to get that first one up, that makes a lot of sense. I think it makes for a more cohesive campaign on the ground too. I think people that are on the ticket as, what we might kind of derogatorily call ticket fillers know that they're a ticket filler and they're not under any illusions about that, which I think is respectful.
You're not going to get game time in the playoffs, but be thankful that you're on the team kind of operation.
Yes.
Yeah, I get it. Love it. And I'm really pleased that I managed to get a basketball metaphor in this podcast. Okay, let's talk about...
That's a sore point right now because Melbourne United just beat the Jack Jumpers in the first game of the NBL finals series last night as we record this. So it's probably best we don't talk any more about basketball yet.
Fair enough, then I won't rub it in. The final week. Let's talk about the final week. What does this look like? Like, what are we expecting from the two parties when the rest of the electorate slowly starts to turn their attention to, oh shit, there's an election on Saturday, I better go vote.
Yeah, it's going to be really interesting. Like the campaign's been, I'd say it's been a pretty frenetic campaign. Like the campaigns each have been operating at a pretty high pace. I reckon everyone's probably exhausted by this point, as is the case in all campaigns. You're kind of running on fumes at this point. And when you also look forward to, potentially this thing not being decided in a minority situation for potentially weeks, everyone's probably staring down the barrel of like a few big weeks. Major set piece events that are happening this week. Today, so Monday as we record this, the AFL is announcing the name of Tasmania's team in the competition, including the first jersey and the logo and all of that stuff. They're doing this in a very socially democratic way, in that they're running a distributed events. Today, they're doing, I think, 7 different kind of hub events across the state, which are free for anyone to attend, where they will unveil kind of simultaneously all of this stuff. And then there are a bunch of satellite events, I think, happening in communities. I don't know if they're self-organized or not, but that would be extremely cool if they were. I'm not sure who's advising the AFL on this strategy, but it's a good strategy for building excitement around the team. So the reason I mentioned that in the context of the campaign is obviously recall that the construction of a stadium in Hobart has been a political flashpoint for a couple of years now. It is a precondition for a team in the AFL. The current government is committed to building the stadium. The federal government has given federal infrastructure money to the stadium precinct to facilitate that. The Labor opposition is... the current position is that obviously support the team, but seek to renegotiate the arrangement with the AFL for the necessity of having a stadium. So that's the position that we're taking to the election. So the unveiling of the team, I would imagine on the Liberal side, they are hoping that that's going to kind of produce a surge of, Tasmanian patriotism and excitement for the team, which they're hoping will rebound on them as the government that was in power when it happened. Obviously, Labor wants to line up in strong support of the team, so we'll be attending, those events as well. But the Liberals will be hoping that sets the tone for the rest of the week.
It's fascinating. It's also an insight into, I guess, social politics in Tasmania, in that there was always a bit of a debate, wasn't there, internally within the island about where does the stadium go because of the divide between the northern part of the island and the southern part of the island. It's a bit like sort of, the Carolina Panthers, and there's North Carolina and the South Carolina. So where do you put the stadium,
Yeah.
Shout out to a good friend of mine, Clutch, big Panthers fan. And so it's interesting that the AFL have intentionally created these simultaneous launches distributed across the island, because that's it. I'm assuming, correct me if I'm wrong here, Jack, but the intention is to show that this isn't just a club that is situated in Hobart, but it is a club for all Tasmanians. Therefore, we are investing in parts of all of the most important parts of the state. And so where they're doing it, I guess, is all the sort of major urban hubs of the island would be right.
Yes, yeah, that's right. And that's important because while there is significant opposition to the stadium in Hobart, generally among people who live in Hobart, and kind of the idea of a big, what they would see as a big stadium being put up in the kind of waterfront precinct area, there is significant opposition in the north because this is seen as another infrastructure project given to the south and given to Hobart. So there is an attempt, obviously by the AFL to make sure that the north, where a lot of our great footballers come from, and where football's a really big tradition, are bought into this team. So they're clearly like pulling out all the stops and wanting this team to go ahead. But what happens to the stadium in the negotiations in any potential minority government situation is going to be really, really fascinating.
I wonder if our Labor campaigns have got wind of this and have sort of happened to turn up at these sites as well. And being able
Well,
to
I
sort of
think there's
jump on the
there's
coattails.
yeah, I mean, I imagine they will be there as fans, as if nothing else, and also you don't want to not be seen there. It's kind of you don't want to be seen the last one to stop clapping at the Politburo, you know. But it is explicitly a non-political event, and the premier and the Labor leader has said this will not politicise this event. We won't make this about the stadium, but we'll see.
Sure, sure. What else in terms of this final week? You just gave something away that was interesting as well. You said in your remarks that you don't think that the election result will be potentially known on election night. Just talk us through your thinking there.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing is that in a Hare Clark system, particularly when you now have 7 elected from each electorate, it just takes a really long time to count those votes, particularly for that 7th spot, distribute all those preferences. So naturally, counting will just take time. And if it was a strong majority either way, that probably wouldn't matter so much, and you would know who was going to form government. But if it's really close, if the Labor vote, like we talked about earlier, if some of those votes parked with independents come over to the Labor side, and suddenly a few seats in play could mean that the two parties were within a seat of each other, or even pegging, that could mean that we're unable to kind of know who forms government until those final seats are decided. Even if those final seats are decided, the count proceeds quicker than we expect. There still could be a period of wrangling and kind of chasing down votes to form a majority on the floor. So I reckon it will depend a lot on how quick the vote gets counted, what happens in those last the 7th positions on the ticket, and it will depend a little bit on, I think, the signals that the Greens send on election night, and if there is a block of Lambie folks elected, if they're sending signals very quickly that they're for Labor or the Liberals, then I think that could cause the media and kind of the public to kind of make an assumption about where government is going. But I certainly wouldn't say it's certain until we actually start to see the makeup of the parliament.
Yeah, right. What are your plans for election day and the evening of?
Well, again, the quirk of the Tasmanian system, there is no handing out how to votes in Tasmania. So there is not very much to do on election day in Tasmania. So I'll probably just be having a normal day on election day. But then in the evening, there's various there's various parties and stuff to go to. So probably just be checking them out. I'll go and check out the tally room, the last one in Australia, where you can see the votes come in and you get to see all the party leaders speak, which is really quite fun.
Love that.
So you get to see the premier or the incoming premier speak, which is really cool. So that'll be my election night.
I mean, you don't have to do this if you don't want to, but predictions or expectations. I know we've sort of touched on it a little bit throughout the episode, but I mean, okay, let me put it this way: what particular electorates are you going to be prioritising in terms of paying attention to when looking at the results coming in on from 6 o'clock on Saturday?
Yeah, look, I'm gonna just do the home court thing. I'm going to be paying particular attention to Clark for a couple of reasons. Clark is the electorate where we have the least amount of MPs right now. We only have 1, so there's the most potential to gain. It's the state's biggest city. It includes Hobart. We have real potential to pick up 2 seats there. If our numbers were significantly improved, maybe 3. We have some great candidates running there. We have Josh Willey coming down from the upper house. There's some potential future, very senior members of the party that could be elected in Clark. So I'm really interested in what happens in Clark. I'm also interested from the point of view that the electoral boundaries also are the same electoral boundaries as the federal division of Clark. So Andrew Wilkie, the current federal member, has been there a while. I would expect he would contest the next election, but that's not going to go on forever. So at a certain point, you've got a seat that is pretty well Labor demographic or potentially Teal demographic seat, and Labor really is going to need to win that seat back federally, if not in the next election and in the one after. So I'm really interested to see what happens in Clark, what potential contenders for Clark might emerge, the federal seat, and also what happens to our vote, particularly in some of those wealthier areas where on the mainland, Labor has been able to improve, particularly in Victoria. So I'm interested to see if anything happens there. I'm also really interested in Franklin, which is the seat that runs to the south of Hobart into the Huon Valley. Interested to see what happens to David O'Byrne's vote there. He's spending a significant amount of money on his campaign, former Labor leader. I'm interested to see, there's reports that he has a lot of support in the community, but we'll find out on election night. So I'm really interested to see what happens there.
So there you go, folks. Franklin and Clark, keep an eye on those, and keep an eye on, if you're not following Jack on Twitter, I highly recommend you do that, because I'm sure you'll be reasonably busy with your thumbs on.
I'll probably have some takes.
Yeah, absolutely. What is it? Just I will put the handle in the bio as well, but just for folks now audibly, what is your Twitter handle?
That's a great question. So it's at JackM_here, at JackM_here. But I'm sure Stephen will retweet me, and you can grab me there.
Indeed, I will. I'll just put you on automatic retweets for the night.
Oh, I don't know. That's dangerous.
Very good. Jack, once again, thanks so much for your time on the show today. Really appreciate the conversation. Really good insights in preparation for Saturday. Don't forget, to everyone listening, particularly in our Tasmanian audience, the election actually isn't over. These polls are just polls. This isn't actually the result. Therefore, it is still winnable. Labor can get themselves into a position to either form a minority government with the various crossbenchers, or, on a good day, maybe even jag a majority. But in order to do that, you need to go and knock on doors and make calls. So we'll put up a link to the volunteer page for Tasmanian Labor. Please, in these final 5 days, and on these final 5 days, knock on doors, make calls. This is the best thing that you can do to ensure that Labor is in a position to get back in a government. So I encourage everyone to do that.
And just to add to that, Stephen, if you're on the mainland and you don't fancy a trip down to knock on doors in Tasmania, please donate. And you can do that on the party's website as well. We have a structural fundraising disadvantage here, and any money we receive in the next couple of days, the party receives, they can deploy. So that's helpful if you can't volunteer as well.
Fantastic. We'll put all those links in today's bio. This episode's going out intentionally earlier than normally dropping it on a Friday. So there's no episode this Friday. This is your Friday episode early. But Jack, we'll be back next week, because we will then do a review of Saturday night, and hopefully have a positive story to tell. As one of our listeners pointed out, every time we do an episode on elections, we get a great result. So, we like to keep this trend continuing for Socially Democratic.
Yeah, see you back here for the trilogy.
Indeed. Thanks, Jack. Have a great week. Good luck, and we'll talk to you next week.
Cheers.
Thanks for listening to Socially Democratic. Did you like the podcast? Hit the follow or subscribe button, and be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcast or Podchaser. And to get all the latest on Socially Democratic, follow Dunn Street on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And we'll see you next Friday.